Hey everyone, today I wanted to give you an introduction to Modo, specifically the user interface and what does what. It can be a little bit overwhelming at times, so we're gonna kind of hash out where most of the stuff is, and then we'll kind of teach you some tools to get started in playing around with this 3D program. Just a side note here, I'm going to actually be using another app that you won't see when you're using Modo, but it will let you see whatever keys I'm pressing on the keyboard and mouse. Alright, so when you first open Modo after you've done your license setup, you should see this Modo intro video. And it actually has a couple of interesting links, specifically this quick start guide. If you were to click that, it's going to open up a page on the Foundry website that has a couple of links and videos to learn the basics, right? You can also click on Modo tutorials here, and there's some other training. There's a lot of free stuff that's kind of worth watching, but you know, do not by any means feel like you need to watch it for the class or that you need to pay for anything from this site, because there are some paid tutorials here. Okay. Um, that being said, we really don't need anything in this page, so I'm just going to close that out. And this is the UI that you should be seeing, right? If you're seeing anything really weird or very different from this, what you could do is go to File, Reset, and that should kind of reset this layout. You'll see in my case that added this sidebar here, but I'm not going to worry about that for now. Go back to this. So the first thing I want to talk about is this kind of dark gray bar on top here. This bar is the switcher for different UIs in the program. Basically, it has a bunch of tabs here, and the different tabs will give you access to different tools that relate to a specific topic in 3D. Topics include modeling the actual 3D shapes, animating them, coloring them, lighting them, and actually producing images from those shapes. And a bunch of other stuff. There are layouts for VR, there are layouts for video game engines, and actually in this list here, you'll see there are only 6 listed, but if we click on this little star only icon, it's going to show a bunch of other ones that aren't quote unquote favorited or starred. So we have topology, paint, setup, game. So if you're seeing a weird outline or weird layout for your Modo, just know that we're mainly going to be working in the Modo layout or the model layout for the first few weeks of this course. Again, if you click this star, it's going to hide the ones that are not starred. And if you were to click anywhere in this dark bar, it's going to minimize that. So a lot of people will say, I don't even see those tabs. You just need to click on this dark line up here, and that's going to bring this down. Okay. So by default, we should see the Modo layout here. So the first thing we want to do is get access to our toolbar. The toolbar is actually hidden in the Modo layout. It's visible in the model panel, but in the Modo layout, it's kind of hidden in this little bar on the left side of my screen. So if I click on this little triangle, that should expose my main toolbar. And you'll see our toolbar is split up into different tasks, like creating geometry, selecting geometry, deforming it, duplicating it, editing it. Then there's kind of more tools for specific parts of our geometry, specifically vertices, edges, and polygons, and we'll get into what all of that means in a bit. But we're just going to go back to the Create panel, and I did want to also point out that there are other layouts for this toolbar, and those can be accessed here. So we're going to be, for now, focusing on this model layout for the toolbar, which is right there. Okay. Next to the toolbar, we have this big window, which is going to be called our viewport. It's where we will see all of our 3D models and how we'll actually do all the work we're doing. There's a bunch of tools to change how it looks and how we see our 3D objects in our screen. Then on the right side of our screen, there is a scene panel, which shows all the items that are in our scene. Every file that we have in 3D is considered a scene file, and they'll have a light by default, it will have a camera by default, and a what's called an empty mesh item, which is where our geometry or models will sit. And then underneath the object or scenes list here, we're going to have the properties for whatever object we've selected. And you'll see if I select the camera, it's going to show me my camera properties. If I select light, it's going to show me my light properties. We'll get into that in a bit, but just a couple more things about the layout itself. Down at the bottom of my screen over here where it says no info right now, if I mouse over anything, it will tell me what my left, middle, and right mouse button will do. So here it says left double click, select connected, left click and drag, 3D select pick, right click, viewport context menu, pop-up menu. So for example, if I hit right click, it's going to bring up that menu, right? So it's good to know that that's there just so you can kind of see what your mouse will be doing if you ever need to investigate anything. Then above the actual viewport, we have a bunch of selection tools and tool modifiers, and we'll be going through all of those as well. And then you'll also notice that these panels on the sides have other panels built in as tabs. We won't be working with these immediately, so you don't have to be too worried about them. But for now, you want to kind of have it on scene and properties. Okay. So the first thing we want to do here is start throwing in some 3D shapes for you guys to play with. The easiest way to do that is to go to the Create panel here, and we have a bunch of primitive shapes like the cube, the sphere, the ellipsoid, a cone, a toroid, a cylinder, and a capsule. And what we're going to do is instead of just clicking on that button, we're going to hold down the Shift key, which, by the way, you can see that I've highlighted down here when I hold down the Shift button. And you'll see these little plus icons show up next to some of these shapes. You'll notice that this shape actually changes from a text to a flat plane, and the ellipsoid changes from its shape to a teapot shape. But as soon as we hold Shift and click on one of these, we're going to get a 3D object where these two lines intersect, right? So once you've added an object in 3D, there's a couple of things we can do that aren't super exciting, but you can click on it to select it. You can click off of it to deselect it. You can also click on it in your scene menu here. So that would select it, and you can see it gets this kind of orange highlight. Or you can select something else, or you can just select nothing by clicking down here or somewhere in the empty scene. But that doesn't really get us anywhere, right? So we want to be able to first kind of look at this object and look around it, because this is 3D. What's the point of it just being kind of like a drawing on our screen? So a couple of hotkeys we're going to learn here that are going to be really essential to you. You essentially want to let these become muscle memory and get used to just exploring the scene. Okay, so the first one is going to be the Alt key, and you'll see it will highlight here, and as soon as I click it, my mouse is going to change to this kind of rotation arrow. You'll also notice that down here where it says what my mouse does, those values all change when I hold down my Alt key, right? So once I hold Alt down, I can click and drag to kind of rotate around my object, right? Now that's fine and all, but if I want to do something more than rotate, I can hold down Alt and Shift, and that will let me pan my camera, meaning move my camera left, right, up, or down. And to kind of zoom into whatever you have in your scene, all you have to do is use the mouse wheel. So scrolling up will zoom in, scrolling down will zoom out. It's not technically a zoom, but it will bring you closer to your object. It's tracking. Your camera will get closer to your objects, right? So you want to kind of get used to this whole idea of like holding Alt to rotate around your scene, holding Alt and Shift to move your camera, flat, like in a flat plane, and then zooming with your mouse wheel. You want to be very comfortable with that. It might take a few weeks, honestly, and that's fine, but you want to just kind of keep one hand on the mouse and one hand on the keyboard. So with that being said, next thing we're going to do is throw in some more items. So I'm just going to hold down my shift key and I'm going to click on a couple of these shapes here. And you'll see a couple of things, right? Like every time I add another shape, the previous shape kind of becomes transparent. And you'll also notice that all the objects come into existence kind of in the same place in our scene. So this brings up a couple of points. The first one is that by default, MODO will only kind of highlight the object that you have selected. And if you select multiple items, you can do that either by holding down the shift key and clicking on different items here, or holding down the shift key and clicking on items here. Now this is going to work as a list, so if I hold down shift and click on the cylinder, it's going to select everything in between. If I want to select individual things, I can hold down control and then click on whatever I want to select, right? In this viewport, the control key will essentially invert your selection. So if it's not selected right now, it's going to add it to your selection. If it is already selected, it's going to remove it from your selection. Okay? But with them all being in the same place, there's not much I can do. Now, this brings up another important concept about MODO. Right now, I clicked outside, and you'll notice everything's highlighted, but nothing's selected. So you kind of want to watch out for when you see the orange outline, right? Another way of looking at that is you can see what's highlighted in your scene menu. Okay. Now, just a note about the display here. The kind of grid-like items that aren't selected, they're being shown in what's called a wireframe view. So it like is the frame of the object made out of a wire. And there's a bunch of different options for how we look at our scene, and most of those are found under here where it says default. So if I click that, if I click on wireframe, all the objects, including the selected objects, are going to be in this wireframe view. I can look at it as a solid, in which case there's no sense of kind of the lighting, it's all just a flat color. And there's just a bunch of different modes here that you can play around with. I tend to stick to default for most of the time, but when you're doing like kind of more intense scenes, you might want to look at advanced, which will do some more reflections and some basic shadows. You can see here that my computer is kind of struggling to switch over to that advanced viewport because it does take a little bit more power to calculate the display. For now, I'm just actually going to go back to shaded, or rather default, and you'll see that that kind of leaves the viewport very responsive and interactive. Another thing I want to bring out, just right while we're here, we have some buttons on the side here. The first one is essentially going to let you click and drag to pan your scene. That's the same as holding Alt and Shift. The second one here is going to let you rotate, so that's the same as holding Alt. The third one here is going to let you track your cameras, move it closer or further away from your scene. And then the fourth one here is very important. The fourth one is going to minimize this viewport that we're looking at, and it's going to expose 3 other viewports, right? So in these viewports, you'll notice that they kind of have the same layout with the buttons and the information, but this viewport here is our top, so we're looking at our scene from the top of it. This one here is the perspective, that is kind of the 3D version that we were looking at. This one down here is the front, and this one down here is the right. So it's the scene from the right side of our scene. The other thing you'll notice is that there is this button here, and you can kind of use it to alternate. So if I wanted to look from the left, I can just click left, and we'd be looking at my scene from the left side. If I wanted to look at it from the bottom, I can do that as well, right? I'm gonna go back to top. I'm just used to having top, front, and right, but you know, you can always change it, and you can always change it back. A couple of other things. So like, of course, all 3D is kind of based on geometry, right? And in geometry, you have your X, Y, and Z axis. Most people in high school might have only encountered X and Y. And if we look at our front view here, right, I'm going to actually full screen this by clicking this double arrow icon. And I can kind of zoom into my objects here. And you'll notice down on the lower left corner, we have our x-axis and our y-axis. So y is up and down, x is left and right. And then if we look at the other panels here, you'll notice that the right is showing me my y, but it's showing me my z, right? Because I'm kind of looking at my object from the x angle or x-axis. So it's showing just those two. And then the top is just showing my x and my z. Now, you don't need to have like the greatest understanding of geometry to pass this course. We're not going to be doing like intense math or anything. So don't let that frighten you. It's just something that is kind of useful for orientating yourself in the 3D view. Okay. Another thing to note here is that the 0 key on the number pad, so not on the main keyboard, not this one, but the one on the side, which I unfortunately don't have in this display, that will let you full screen or minimize any of the panels while your mouse is in this viewport. That is essentially saying it will click this button for you as a hotkey. However, like if I have my mouse up here and I press the 0 button, it's going to full screen it. And if I move my mouse to the front view here and I haven't clicked in that viewport yet, if I hit 0, it's going to full screen that one. This can get a little confusing in the UI, especially early on, because if my mouse is over the scenes panel here and I hit the 0, it's going to kind of quote unquote full screen that in this sidebar. Same thing for the properties here. That's going to full screen the properties panel. So if you don't see one of these by default, it might just be that you need to put your mouse over the panel and hit the 0 key on the numpad, right? You might see the same thing happen on this side where you lose that kind of toolbar over here. And there's sometimes a menu that will be down here that you will also lose. So if for some reason you're not seeing a part of the UI that you're expecting to see, you might just need to unfull screen one of those panels. All right. So I'm going to just full screen this main panel again, this time by clicking the button instead of the hotkey. But let's take another look at some of our objects here. Now, by default, the scene is going to be this wireframe view for objects that aren't selected and a shaded view for objects that are selected. We actually have an option right here, and if you mouse over any of these, it's going to tell you what they do. The important one here is this option for make inactive same as active, meaning make the unselected objects the same as the selected objects. So if I click that, everything's going to look shaded, and sometimes this will kind of help you get a better view of what's in the scene. So I tend to turn that on regularly. There are also a lot of other options for these viewports, and they can be found either underneath this gear icon or by just clicking the O key while your mouse is in the viewport. So it brings up your 3D viewport properties. And a couple of things about these floating panels really quickly. So you can see that as soon as I click outside of it, it disappears and I have to click the O button to bring it back. There is this little circle with a cross in it. And I know a lot of people just assume that's to close the panel, but in the case of MODO, that is to pin the panel open. So if I click that, now it will stay open regardless of what else I click, right? In here, there's a bunch of different options for, active meshes, meaning things you have selected, inactive meshes, things you don't have selected, and specifically in the inactive meshes, there's that same button for make inactive same as active, and you see if I turn that on here, it's going to turn it on here. There's also an option to make the inactive items invisible, which is the button right before that over here. So if you needed to, you can kind of work over here, but a lot of the common options are out here now. The other thing I want to point out in this drawing section is that all of our 3D models really have three components. They have the edges, the points where the edges meet, and then the surfaces that are made up of those edges. And those points where the lines meet are called vertices, but by default MODO won't highlight them. So what I tend to do is I will go to the active mesh section, and there's this option for show vertices, and I always set that to always. Now that's actually a very minor change here, it's almost not noticeable. You can see the dots in the video. They'll disappear if I go down to never. They'll appear if I go to always. But because it's kind of very small, I tend to do show independent point size and then increase that kind of a bit. Let's try like 6, and that just makes them a little bit larger so you can see exactly where they are. And later on, when we need to select those, it will be a little bit easier for you guys to do that. All right. With that being said, I don't need this panel anymore, so I'm just going to unpin it, and that's going to close it right away. And now we're going to talk about how to move these items, because in the middle they're not doing anybody any good, right? So first thing we want to do here is select what we want to move. You're always going to want to select whatever you want to modify first. Make sure that that's selected properly, and then you select what you want to do with it, and then you actually do whatever you want to do with it. So the first thing I'm going to do here is select the toroid, or this donut shape, and I'm going to use these tools over here. So there's a move tool, there's a rotate tool, and there's a scale tool, and these are attached to the hotkeys W, E, and R. So if I click the W key, it's going to turn that on, or if I click on this button here, that's going to turn on my rotate tool, and if I click this button here, it's going to turn on my scale tool. So again, it's W, E, and R on the keyboard, and you can kind of switch between them. If you ever want to get out of a tool, you can hit spacebar, and it will basically turn that tool off. Or you can hit the same tool again, so I can like turn it on, turn it off, or use the hotkey, W to turn it on, W to turn it off. When you have the tool active, we have what's called a transform manipulator over here in the middle of our object. That tool is that's basically the handles for using the tool in question, right? So with the move tool active, I'm just going to click on this red handlebar, click and drag, and it's going to move it in the direction of that arrow, right? If I was to grab it in this green handlebar, it's going to move it up and down. In this blue handlebar, it's going to move it in the kind of towards and away from the camera, okay, in the Z-axis. All right. So first thing we're going to do is just move all of these out of the way so they're not kind of on top of each other. So I'm going to click W, move that over, hit space to get out of the move tool, select another object, hit W, move that over, hit space to get out of it, select another object, move this over, hit space to get out of it. So essentially when I hit the space button, I am saying go back into select mode and then let me select another object, right? So I'm going to actually turn on that show all as active button right there, make inactive same as active, and we're going to try some of the other tools here. So we've used the move tool, and if we go to the rotate tool, you'll see that I have a different looking transform manipulator, and if I highlight any of these lines, it's going to let me rotate the object in that axis. So this is over my red axis, which will always be my X. This is over my Z axis, which will always be my blue axis. And then this is over my green axis, which will always be my Y axis. Okay? So let's say we rotate this. Now, as I rotate this, you'll notice that in the properties panel, it's going to show me how much I've rotated the object. So if I wanted to, instead, I could definitely type in a value here, like negative 90 degrees, hit enter, and it's going to turn that object for me. And then we have our scale tool. So I'm actually going to hit spacebar, select this cube, and click the R key to activate my scale tool. And you'll notice it has these kind of different handlebars. So the move handlebar in the W key will have these arrows, versus the scale tool will have these cubes. And if I click and drag on any of these, it's going to scale in that direction. So that's my x-axis, this is my y-axis, and then this is my z-axis. All right. Another really important hotkey, Control Z will undo Control Shift Z will redo, but redo is kind of iffy in 3D because of how selection and deselection works. Um, but Control Z is very useful, and you'll see me doing that all the time just because I want to show a different concept or try something differently, right? Um, so I think that's kind of standard from other programs. You guys should hopefully have used Control Z before. Um, the next thing I want to talk about is some of the other options in this transform manipulator. So first of all, if I hit the plus button, which is also the equal button, right, on the keyboard over here, it's going to kind of grow or shrink that transform manipulator. So if it's like too small and you can't like really hold the controls or click on them, you can just press the plus key to grow that out. You'll notice that there are, in addition to just these 3 arrows, there's a cube in the middle there, and then there are these circles kind of between the arrows, right? So the cube is essentially going to let you move in X, Y, and Z at the same time. And honestly, that can be a little bit difficult to follow because of the fact that we're looking at this kind of flat in our perspective view, but you know, it might look like I'm moving it left or right when honestly I might be moving it kind of further down than I expect. And that's kind of why we want to have control over these arrows as well. But these circles here will essentially let me move the object in 2 axes at once, right? So for example, if I was to move this cube up here, kind of above this invisible or like faded grid, if I knew that I wanted this cube to stay at this height, but I needed to move it up, like move it left or right or towards and away from the camera, I can kind of control it in my X and Z directions at the same time by selecting the circle between them. So this circle here is going to let me move left, right, backwards and forwards without actually ever changing the height of the object, right, where it is in the y-axis. Similarly, this circle will let me move in Y and X and Y, without moving it towards or away from the camera, and this one will let me move it kind of towards and away from the camera, up or down, but it will never change how far left or right it is, right? Even though from here it looks like I'm closer to the left of my screen, and then when I go here it looks like I'm on the right of my scene. If I look at my scene from the front, you'll notice it hasn't actually moved left or right relative to the kind of origin starting point of everything, right? So let's move that back up here. No. And similarly, if we go to our scale tool, we have those circles as well. So this is scaling evenly in my X and Y axis. Control Z. This is scaling evenly in my X and Z. And Control Z one more time. This is scaling evenly in my Y and Z axis, right? So if you want to kind of make a shape that is specifically, you know, symmetrical in certain aspects, you can definitely use those. All right. Gonna take a second here to just say, you know, for these first week or two, you won't really need to be saving your work. If you want, you can just, you know, file and save, but really I'm just going to hit Control W, which is to close this scene, and it's just going to ask me to save. I don't need to save it. Once I do that, I'll be in a new empty scene with a untitled scene, an empty mesh object, a camera, and a direction light. And I'm just going to add in another cube here, right? So another useful hotkey to have is Control D, and that's going to duplicate the selected object. And honestly, with just the tools that you have so far, you can kind of start creating things. So this is usually what we spend like a few hours doing the first week. For example, I'm going to take this cube, right? I'm going to shrink it down to make it kind of flat. Then I'm going to scale it out in my X and Z to kind of make a floor, right? Just a note here, I'm going to be adding a lot of cubes into my scene, so I can go in and rename them. So all I have to do is click this and wait a second, or right click this and hit rename, just to kind of keep my scene organized. So I'm just going to call this my floor. And then I'm going to throw in another cube. So I'm going to hold down shift, click here, and I'm going to kind of make walls for this. So I'm going to just move this back here. And it doesn't have to be precise right now. If I wanted it to be precise though, I could definitely hit that 0 key and then look at my objects from these views and kind of lay that flat on top of that floor item and kind of move it over. And I can also, use my move, scale, and rotate in these views. So if I wanted to scale this to be kind of flatter, I can say from my top view, let's make this flatter. And then in my right view, I just want to go back to my move tool. And notice I didn't have to hit space. I can go from one tool to the other. So move tool, W key, scale tool, R key. I'm just going to kind of move this back a little bit so it's lined up with the back of my floor. And then I'm going to scale it out so it's kind of the same length as that floor. Something like that. So I'm looking over here in my front view right now. Just going to drag that out. 0 key to minimize this again. And I'm going to make this a little bit taller too. So as soon as I make this taller, you'll notice it's making it taller from the center of the object. I'm going to actually shrink my transform manipulator. And I'm going to make it, let's go with something like that, right? So it scales it up from the center of the object by default. So I'm just going to move this up again to kind of make this wall sit on top of the other platform. And from here, I'm just going to hit Control D, and then that's going to make the copy and select it. But the copy is going to be in the same spot, so it doesn't really show that there's a copy outside of the fact that there's another cube here. So this cube, I'm just going to move over to the other side of my scene. I'm just going to eyeball that, not going to worry about my right view and lining things up right away. Now I'm going to actually just duplicate that one more time, and I'm going to use my rotate tool to kind of position this. I'm going to just say rotate -90 degrees, and I'm just going to look at this from the top here, go to my move tool, use that little, I know the height's right, so I don't need to change the Y value. I'm just going to grab it from here and move that over. And for now, I'm not going to worry about it overlapping. That's going to be fine. There are cases where we wouldn't want that, but for this example and your first week in 3D, totally fine. Control D one more time and move that over. And now I'm just going to go through and rename these. So this is going to be the back wall. You could use spaces. You honestly should use underscores, so back wall like that, but it shouldn't really matter. For our uses. Front wall. This will be my left wall. And this will be my right wall. Oops. Okay. Now let's throw in some other shapes. So I'm going to throw in like a cylinder. And I'm going to bring this up. Scale it to be taller. And I'm going to make it a little wider like that. Then before I move that, I'm actually going to add a cone and move that up on top. And I'm going to scale this. Now I'm going to scale it from the middle so it scales in every direction at once. And I noticed that that's a little too tall, so I'm just going to scale it down a little bit like that. And we'll call that good, right? So I'm going to actually select both of these together. So I click one, shift click the other. And then I'm going to go to my move tool, and I'm going to move this to kind of line up with that corner. And this is another time where I'm like, I'll probably be getting a better job done if I look at this from the top view. So I'm going to go to my top view here, kind of zoom into that, and just put it here. Now with both of these selected, I'm going to hit Control D, and that's going to copy both of them, right? So I'm just going to move both of those over here. Now what I can do is select all four of those, the two cylinders and the two cones, and hit Control D one more time, and you'll see it has 4 more copies. I'm just going to move those back here. Okay. You'll notice before it looks like those aren't selected in this viewport because they're overlapping with the other ones. So just keep in mind that the copy did happen, which you'll notice over here, and then just kind of move that into place to wherever you want it. And if I hit 0, we kind of have the starting of a castle. Now these guys are all a little bit too high, so I'm just going to grab them all, and I was just clicking and dragging to select. And I'm just going to move all of those down to say somewhere like that. I'm going to actually move these cones up a little. Okay. Again, you should, if you're making something like this, definitely go through and rename all the objects, but just kind of wanted to give you an idea of how to start modeling basic shapes, so you guys can kind of play around with it, have fun with it, get used to some of these hotkeys. I do want to talk about a couple of more useful hotkeys before I do another little example. And the first one of those is going to be the interactive help hotkey, or F1. You can find that actually under help, in activate help, or you can press the F1 key on your keyboard and it will turn your cursor into this question mark. If I click on anything while my cursor is this question mark, the program will launch like the help page for that kind of tool. So if I click on like my move tool, it's going to bring me to the MODO documentation for move, and it will kind of tell you, what the tool does, how it works, what are the different options. There are certain pages in the documentation that are very useful, and when we come around to those pages, I will like bring up the documentation and show you different examples within that. But for now, let's actually start one more new scene, and we'll build a snowman. Alright, so we're just going to ditch this scene with Control W, don't bother saving. So we're going to build a snowman, and I'm just going to start with throwing in a sphere. One useful hotkey to know about navigating your scene is the A and Shift A hotkey. So if I have multiple objects in my scene like that, pressing A will move your camera to a location that can see all the objects. But if I have an object selected and I press Shift and A, it's going to zoom in on just the selected object. So if I have both of these selected and press Shift and A, it's going to be the same as hitting A, and it won't do anything. But if I am zoomed in on one and I press A, it's going to show me everything in my scene. Let me just delete this cube. So to delete it, all I have to do is select it and hit the delete key on my keyboard, not the backspace key. You can also right click, and there should be a delete here somewhere. Yep, down here. Okay. So select that object, Shift and A, and I'm going to scale this object to be larger. Then I'm just going to duplicate this, Control D, and I'm going to move that up a bit. I'm going to scale it down a bit, right? Something like that. I'm going to Control D one more time. And the order doesn't really matter, right? I can scale it down first and then move it up, but it's harder to see because you're scaling it down while it's inside the other object. So just be aware of that. So let's say that this is going to be our snowman. Next thing I want to do is, let's add a little scarf for him. Click on a torus, and you'll notice it's kind of hidden inside that original object. So I just went to my move tool to kind of move that out. But you could definitely just switch over to a wireframe if you needed to. But yeah, I'm gonna kind of put this around the neck, and I'm just going to scale that out like that. And then at this point, those vertices, those points are kind of getting distracting, so I'm going to turn that off really quick, just or bring the size down to something, because I'm not working with them right now. So let's do like 2. So here I'm going to add in another sphere, kind of bring that up, and we're going to flatten this out by just scaling down in the z-axis, and then we're going to kind of shrink it down in x and y using that blue circle. I'm just going to move this kind of down here, and I'm looking at this from different angles, so at this point I might want to just go to these side views and press the A key to kind of frame up my object, and I can position it here. And in these side views, it's sometimes more convenient to use that center square because it will limit you to the two axes that the side views are looking from. So I'm going to kind of position this here. Maybe I'll make it a little bit bigger, like that, kind of as a button. And before I rotate this to kind of sit on the snowman, I'm going to just duplicate this a few times. So I'm hitting Control D, and you'll notice I'm in the Move tool, and I'm hitting Control D, and it leaves me in the Move tool. And I can move this up or down. Might be too many, but we'll see. Alright, so I can select all of those, move them back a little bit until they're kind of intersecting with my object, and then let's say select, that one's almost there, so we can zoom in a little bit here, kind of rotate this and push it back. Do the same here, we'll move it back and rotate it. Select this guy, and I know I'm moving fairly quickly, but you know, as you practice the different hotkeys, you will get faster. So if this takes you like half an hour, that's totally fine, right? You just want to develop that muscle memory. And so now we have a bunch of buttons, right? We can actually grab this center one that we didn't really rotate. We'll duplicate it one more time, move it up. We'll use the same buttons for the eyes. So here, I'm going to kind of move this back and see where it is in my 3D view so that I can kind of rotate this. Now, one of the things I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a mental note of how much I'm rotating this. So it's negative 10.5 degrees. And I'm just going to move this back a little bit and maybe down a little, right? Now, if I duplicate this item, Control D, for the other side, it's going to have the same values. So what I'm going to say is I'm just going to make the negative rotation a positive rotation, so it should turn the same amount for the other side. And then my X position here, because remember the red axis is my X, that's negative 370 millimeters. Just a quick note, the stuff that you model in 3D doesn't have to be real world dimensions, unless you're doing like super realistic like rendering where the program's going to have to calculate lighting for you. You don't need to worry about the specific size of things, as long as the rest of your scene is the right size in relation to your objects, right? But I'm just going to get rid of that negative, and that's going to move it over the exact same amount on the other side of this blue line, right? So that's going to be my mouth right there, or sorry, my eyes right there. And now I need to do my mouth, so I'm going to duplicate this one more time. And then I'm going to actually make the mouth with kind of smaller stone, so I'm going to bring that down and shrink it in a little bit more. And let's move this guy into place and rotate him. And then I'm going to duplicate that. Let's say move this here, maybe up a little bit, and then duplicate that again. Move that up, and something like that. I'm going to actually move this one a little bit lower, and then this one over a bit. It might be a little creepy. Maybe he's like smiling off to the side. That's fine. If we do want to duplicate these, we can of course do that. And then for those duplicates, we'll just change these values to negative, and then I'm going to move this one a little bit lower, like that. And you'll notice I'm not like being super careful about like how these things are positioned, and that's fine for when you're starting out. You're really just trying to get a handle on the tools and the options, right? Something like that. And then I'm going to throw in a cone for the nose and move it up, rotate it 90 degrees, and let's move this forwards, down. It's way too big, so let's scale it down. I think, so I scaled it from the middle, which is all the axes, but I think it's still a little bit too wide, so I'm going to grab it in the original items X and Z scale, kind of scale that down like that. We'll come back around to why this scale doesn't do exactly what we expect, but basically it comes down to the fact that we rotated the original object, right? So something like that, we'll put it right there, and I'm just gonna let it intersect with the object like that. You know, we can definitely grab all these objects, deselect the camera there, and move them up a little so that it's kind of sitting on where the floor would be. And then we can throw in a cube, or we can, if we're holding shift, we can throw in a floor item and just scale that up from the middle. And there you kind of have a snowman. We definitely need to give him a hat, so I'm gonna throw in a cylinder, move it up here, and I'm actually gonna just duplicate that cylinder, scale it down that way, and scale it out this way, and move that down a bit, and then we can actually select both of those and kind of rotate them back a little. You'll notice that if I rotate both of these together, they're going to rotate independently. So a better way of doing this is probably just delete this guy. We're going to rotate this one, and then Control D, scale it down, and it will keep that rotation, right? Move it over, and then scale it out this way. Okay, so we have our snowman. Both of those examples with the castle and the snowman, you should be able to replicate. The next thing I want to show you is just how to kind of more interactively create these objects that we have. So I'm going to do that in a new scene. Just Control W and don't save. Now here we have a new scene, and we have this kind of empty mesh item, and I know it's empty because it has like this grayed out text. And if I wanted to just draw a shape into my scene, I could do that by clicking one of these tools without holding down the shift key. And so if I was to click on my cube here, it's going to kind of create an invisible grid depending on how I'm looking at my scene, whether I'm looking kind of downwards or towards the back of my scene or towards the right of my scene. And it's going to let me draw on that invisible grid. So if I was to look downwards, it's kind of letting me draw on the floor. If I undo that, reactivate the cube tool without the shift key, if I was to draw this way, it would let me draw on like an invisible wall facing me, right? If I was to rotate this enough, it would let me draw on an invisible wall that way, right? Just a quick note about that. To see that invisible wall, I believe it's under Options, Visibility, Show Work Plane Always. That's going to show you this little grid, right? And you'll see if I rotate my camera enough, it's going to snap to a different axis. Or if I rotate my camera enough this way, it's going to snap to that other axis. But yeah, once I have a tool selected and I start drawing, it's going to kind of give me, first of all, it's going to give me this flat shape, and then I can grab it in the middle to give it some depth. And you'll notice that by default, it's going to draw the shape into what was before an empty mesh item. So that was kind of grayed out before. Now it has some geometry in it, right? You want to be a little bit careful about working like this, because if I go to my move, scale, or rotate tool, you'll notice that the center of my tool is at the center of my scene, not the center of my object. So if I was to scale this, even from the middle here, it's going to scale out from that corner, right? So a good way to get around this is just, let's undo quite a bit, right? We're back to an empty mesh item. We're going to draw in another cube like that, but we're going to look at the tool properties, and that can be either done by clicking this button or hitting the K key on the keyboard. And that's going to bring up this window here. I'm just going to pin that open. Here I can actually set the size of my object, the number of segments or divisions it has along the sides here. So if I say like 3 divisions in my x-axis, I have 1, 2, 3, and we'll talk about that more next week. But it kind of lets you just give different starting properties to your object, or like a specific size or a specific location. So here I'm going to actually set my position to 0, 0, 0. That way the center of my scene is going to be the center of my object, and then it's going to be a lot easier for me to move, scale, and rotate the object after the fact. So with this selected, I'm just going to hit the spacebar, and that's going to get rid of those options. Like, you can't get back to those options once the object's created, so just keep that in mind. Now for a cube, that might not be so useful, because you can just hold down shift and click on a cube and it will create a new mesh item for you. But when you want specific shapes, it might be a little bit more useful to do it that way. Now before I do this, I'm just going to move this over to the back like that, and I'm going to throw in on this mesh object, I'm going to draw in a cone rather. Right, so I'm going to draw this in like that, and I'm going to grab the middle to pull it out. And here you'll see the properties are a little bit different. So instead of having 24 sides, I can say I want 4 sides, so that this is like a pyramid, right? Or even 3 sides, like that, right? And I can have segments, which are just divisions along the sides, which I don't need right now. Just a quick side note about these. So I can type in a value, I can say 0, 0, 0, right? I can use these sliders by clicking and dragging to kind of change the size of that interactively. I can also actually do math here. So if I said I needed 3 times 6 sides, I can do 3 multiplied by 6 and it will give me 18. I can do 18 divided by 6 and it will give me 3, right? So you can do your basic math in here as well. All right. So if I hit spacebar to drop this, I'm gonna have a slight problem, because both of these pieces of geometry are in the same mesh item. So if I was to select one, it's gonna select both. And since I moved the original item back, the center of my object is still there. I'm just gonna close my tool properties there. So what we essentially want to do is every time we're drawing in another item interactively, we want to be able to draw it in a new mesh item. So to do that, I'm just going to actually undo the drawing of this pyramid, which is quite a bit of undos, right? I'm going to press the N key, N as in new, and that's going to create a new empty mesh item. And again, you can see it's grayed out like that. And with that selected, I'm going to draw in my cone again. Oh, I'm drawing it in on the wrong plane, so I'm going to undo that, rotate my camera, and draw it in that way. Draw it out that way, and again, if I hit the K key, it's going to bring up my properties. I can set the same size in X, Y, and Z if I wanted to, and hit space. Now if I go to move, scale, or rotate that, again, that's going to be from the center of my scene. So what I should have done, let's undo, select the empty mesh item, go back to my cone tool here, draw that in, hit the K button and make sure my position is set to 0, 0, 0. Then my size can be whatever I need it to be, so 3 by 2 by 2, maybe. And there we go, right? The starting size is kind of important because when you're scaling after the fact, you'll notice that this is always going to be a percentage of the original starting size. So, if I wanted to make this twice as wide, I can just, or twice as wide in the z-axis, I can just type in 200% and it's going to change it, but it's not going to give me the actual size value for like how many meters or millimeters it is. So yeah, that's how you would draw in these shapes kind of more interactively. Another useful item to do interactively is often the cylinder. So I just selected that and I hit delete on the keyboard, which removes the mesh item altogether. So I need to press the N key to start a new mesh item. I'm going to use a cylinder here. I'm going to draw it out and scale it up. And then if I press the K button, it's going to bring up the properties. Again, I can click here as well. And here I'm going to, again, set the position to 0, 0, 0, but the important thing here is like I can have a triangle, or I can have a square, or a pentagon, or hexagon, and it will give you this kind of nice even shape. So, if you're trying to make a specific shape, that might be useful. This tool property section will be available to you until you hit the spacebar and quote unquote drop the active tool, which is the creation tool in this case. Okay. So using those two methods, I'd like everybody to kind of just play around with the app. Move, scale, and rotate needs to become kind of second nature, as well as selecting different objects and kind of moving your camera around, and adding new objects using the menus on the side here. Honestly, if by next week you can kind of rotate your camera around your scene and look at your objects from different angles, you're in a pretty good place. And I think we're gonna do one last thing that's kind of easy to remember, but it helps a lot when you're starting out. If you want to really quickly just assign a color to an object, you can do that with the M key. So I'm going to select an object, press the M key on my keyboard, M for material, and this is really important. You want to rename the name, so don't call it default or else it will change the color of everything. I'm going to just call this cylinder, and then I'm going to change the color here by clicking on this bar and just picking green. You can also just change the color by clicking and dragging these numbers that go from 0 to 1. So this is my red, right, 1, 0, 0, green, 0, 1, 0, and blue, 0, 0, 1. So you can kind of tune in whatever color you want, or just click on it and select the color here. Okay, and then when I hit OK, that object becomes that color. I can select the cube here and press the M key, and I can actually just assign it the same color by selecting it here, hitting OK. Or I can give it a new color, hitting the M key again, cube, and we'll make this kind of this blue, hit OK. And now if I add in another object like this teapot, let's make it a bit bigger, I can hit M, and then I can assign it to my cylinder color, or I can hit M again and assign it to my cube color. And I think just being able to put quick colors on your objects makes it a lot more interesting, just especially when you're starting out. So I'm hoping everybody can spend some time playing around with this. There's not really a homework assignment other than get MODO installed and try to run through the kind of examples that I did here. As always, hit me up in Discord if you have any questions or issues, and I'll try to get the videos out for next week a little bit earlier, probably by Tuesday. And one of the things we'll be focusing on next week are the actual components that make up our shapes. So again, those vertices or points, the edges, and the polygons or faces between those. and then how we can manipulate those. All right. Uh, Thanks for making it all the way through this. Sorry if it's a little bit awkward. Also, first time kind of recording this stuff ahead of time. So, thanks for bearing with me, and I'll have more for you guys next week.